Taking a look back at my series where I looked at the least expensive watches from luxury brands, when mentioning Omega, I mentioned a couple different options, and many of you in the comments, rightfully so, pointed out, hey, why didn't you mention the Omega DeVille Prestige? And although it didn't fit all the criteria for that particular video, it's an overlooked watch that, when thinking of contemporary Omega, is the lowest dollar entry point to get a taste of the brand. Now, part of why this watch might not be mentioned as frequently is a result of the Omega DeVille collection, as it is a bit of an oddball as a whole. Predominantly a collection filled with dress pieces, it offers some of the most accessible as well as the most expensive watches in Omega's entire catalog. And unlike the Seamaster and Speedmaster collection, where we all know what to expect, the DeVille collection is a bit harder to navigate in order to have a proper perception of what it truly offers. But when you do take a closer look, you identify some hidden gems in the process. And this Omega DeVille Prestige really represents as a perfect example of that description, and being a classically designed piece that will have added appeal with the vintage Omega looks, especially when factoring in the added point worthy of mentioning, the fact that this is the most obtainable new contemporary Omega watch. And before we go any further, big thank you to our friends at Boz Watches for letting me test drive this watch. If you guys want to purchase this watch or any other watch available, like I purchased my Rolex Explorer 2 from them, use the link in the description. That helps us out tremendously in allowing us to do what we're doing here. Now, the DeVille line was introduced back in 1967 and is one that has married itself to the image of elegance, providing different routes compared to many of the sports watches in Omega's catalog. Many of the elements of what made the DeVille a lesser appreciated gem for Omega are presented with this DeVille Prestige, mostly with the case. It needs to be stated, this is a small watch, wearing with a vintage profile of 36.8 millimeters by 42 millimeters lug to lug, and a thickness of 10 millimeters. With its dimensions and unassuming looks, I would certainly classify it as being a unisex watch. To provide an even better sense of how this will wear, this watch wears more like the 34, 35 millimeter watches out there. And as an example, for maybe a mass market type of watch that maybe you guys have been able to wear on your wrist, the Timex Marlin. A little bit different in how it wears because the lugs on that watch are a little bit larger than this. This watch has very tucked in lugs, but in terms of how it's gonna wear on the actual wrist, I think that's a very good example. This particular watch comes with a 19 millimeter lug width. Yeah, I would have preferred 18 or 20 here, but positioned within those lugs, a nice 7-link mesh bracelet, featuring a nicely concealed clasp on the underside. The bracelet gives the watch a much more opulent look without drawing much attention, and like many of these mesh style bracelets, will hug to the wrist nicely. However, in this case, maybe a little bit too much, because if you're on the fence for a small watch, this might be something to consider. But I will say this concept of wearing small watches, I think it's one thing that you can overcome quite easily if you actually just give it a shot. I think a lot of people, if they start wearing a larger watch, they get used to seeing that larger watch on their wrist. The same can be said for smaller watches. And when you get used to just the fact of like the 34, the 35, and 36 millimeter case size, and I don't think it's just a factor of me having a small wrist. I think it's something a lot of people should just give a shot. Similar to the unobtrusive case profile, the same idea is maintained when looking at the dial through the sapphire crystal. On the silver dial, we have applied hour markers, an Omega logo that is also applied, and Roman numeral hour markings at the 12, 3, 6, and 9 with Dauphine hands at the center. Towards the outside of the dial, we have a lifted hour track and a date window at the 3. Other than that, we don't really have much happening here on the dial, not even minute markings along the outside of the dial, something that we rarely see. And in its absence is probably the only aspect that I would say I would consider less than safe in terms of the design. The small crown is signed with the Omega logo and operates traditionally, changing the date at the first position when pulled and time at the farthest position, hacking when doing so. Flipping the watch over, we have a solid case back with little for show, but houses Omega's Co-Axial caliber 2500. The movement itself is an older one for Omega, being featured back in 1999 as the first primary caliber from Omega, utilizing George Daniels' Co-Axial escapement. Since we have seen more common movements, the 8500, the 8800, which have been rolled out in many of their sports watches. However, to get back to the reason I did not mention this watch in my prior series of the most affordable watches from luxury brands, it was really just looking at this movement and not really being technically in-house, with this 2500 being based off an ETA 2892A2. However, this does not by any means make this movement inferior, as this is a very highly modified movement with the added coaxial escapement and is a chronometer grade movement with high accuracy and housing a power reserve of 48 hours compared to the 42-hour power reserve of the base caliber, with it beating at a little bit more unusual 25,200 beats per hour as well. Now, the world of Omega watches, when looking at vintage and pre-owned, can provide a lot of value. I think a very similar feeling how many collectors in general feel much affinity to Seiko, being that brand that was there to usher them into the watch community as a whole. However, in the world of vintage, that of course brings a lot of unmatched charm, and distinction with owning one does bring on equal cons with maintaining and might not be the best place to start. In other words, when looking at this watch, it's clearly a safe design. It's clearly a watch that is going to appeal to vintage roots in design as well with its case profile. But I think that's why this watch should be maybe considered for some people out there. Maybe for somebody looking in to delve into this world of luxury watches for the first time, they want something that has the vintage look, has the price to kind of match that, and has a safe style that will, of course, translate into timelessness. I think this is one that will be perfect for that scenario and for somebody looking to maybe plunge into this world of Omega. And I know once they do, they probably won't stop. So guys, if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. That's a big help for the channel and myself. And also, quick question for you guys. I'd love to see answers in the comments, especially for the larger wrist folks out there. Have you ever tried wearing smaller watches? Do you have a preference? Anybody that has a preference to just wearing smaller watches in general? Love to see stories about that in the comments. Also, if you guys want to purchase this watch or any others, hit the link in the description. That's a big way to help us out purchasing from our friends at Bob's Watches. And then finally, if you want to join our watch giveaway, fill out that watch giveaway form and follow me on Instagram. So guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I'll see you all very soon.